Hey friends, Pastor Kim with Maryville First United Methodist Church. We are on day 25 of our 66 books in 66 days. I can't believe that we've come this far. We are in Lamentations. Lamentations is Jeremiah's lamenting, his sorrow-filled pain, just everything that he was feeling going into this book about Jerusalem and the fall of Jerusalem. The key verse that comes out of the book of Lamentations, it's only 5 chapters long, and so the key verse comes from chapter 2, verse 11. My eyes fail from weeping. I am in torment within. My heart is poured out on the ground because my people are destroyed, because children and infants faint in the streets of the city. Just the sorrow and the mourning that goes on. And so each chapter can be considered its own division, where chapter 1, Jeremiah mourns for Jerusalem. He says, how deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces, now has become a slave. And that is because the destruction of Jerusalem is based on the consequence of sin. And the people, even though they were warned, God's anger burns against them in their sinful ways. And so chapter 1 is Jeremiah mourning, just the sorrow and the sadness, the lamenting that he has for Jerusalem. And chapter 2 is about God's anger at sin. Jeremiah grieves deeply because of the destruction of Jerusalem and the devastation of his nation. But in the middle of this book, you get to chapter 3, and there is hope in the midst of affliction. In the depths of Jeremiah's grief, there is a ray of hope. The sun begins to shine. God's compassion is ever present. His faithfulness is great, and Jeremiah wants to bring that hope into the people's life because their sadness is not going to be forever. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, kind of like where we are right now with our coronavirus keeping us at home, keeping us at a distance from one another, keeping us from doing what we want to do. Hope is in the midst of affliction. And chapter 4 then turns to God's anger becoming satisfied. What we need to understand is that there are serious consequences for our sin, and that should be an awakening for us to say, I can do better. And so in chapter 5, Jeremiah pleads for restoration. It's almost like he pleads for God to restore the people, to bring them back to that beautiful place of Jerusalem. Remember even Jesus walking through Jerusalem, and he just cries out, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the beautiful city that is just so full of brokenness and sin. And so the key verse coming out of chapter 2, verse 11, his eyes are just so full of tears. They're frail. He's so tired and worn out from the weeping. Have you ever cried so much that your body is just incredibly drained, tormented within? His heart was poured out on the ground because he cared and he loved his people, his nation so much. And he had warned them, and they had totally ignored his warning. And so the themes that rise up throughout Lamentations are, of course, the destruction of Jerusalem, but God's mercy. God's compassion was at work even when the Israelites were experiencing the affliction of their conquerors, the Babylonian conquerors. And although the people had been unfaithful, God remained faithful. And God just wants to remind the people that there are consequences to our sin. God was angry at the prolonged rebellion by his people. Sin was the cause of their misery, and destruction was the result of their sin. The destruction of the nation shows the vanity of human glory and pride. Instead of putting pride and honor and glory into God, we put it into ourselves. We become self-prideful, and that is going to cause some destruction in our own lives. But in the end, we find this glimmer of hope. Once again, we have a book in Scripture that lifts up hope. Hope is one of the most beautiful things, and the resiliency of human beings is to trust in the hope of God. God's mercy in sparing some of the people offers hope for the better days to come. One day the people will be restored to a true and fervent relationship with God, and this is what God keeps reminding them of throughout the books of these prophets. Even when you get into the minor prophets, after Isaiah and Jeremiah, we go into some minor prophets that are shorter books, but they have a very powerful message for a very specific time of God's people. And so God has this anger against the people's sin, but chapter 3 speaks of the hope in the midst of affliction. And I want to share with you parts of chapter 3, beginning in verse 16. He has broken my teeth with gravel. He has trampled me in the dust. I have been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what prosperity is. So I say, my splendor is gone, and all that I had hoped for from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I remember well them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Verse 22, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. And so the hope rises. And Jeremiah writes in Lamentations, I call this to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because the Lord, his great love, because of it we are not consumed. His compassions, they fail not. That's how we get some of those beautiful hymns, you know. His mercies are new each and every day, and his compassion never fails. And so since we know that his compassions never fail, we are not consumed by the things around us, which reminds me of what we read in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, as Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. In chapter 3, Paul had written about the glory of the new covenant being greater than the old covenant, because the new covenant is the final covenant, the beautiful covenant of our relationship of new life in Jesus Christ by the blood that Christ shed, that his blood was spilt for us. And so we have this mission and this ministry that is such an incredible blessing. And in chapter 4, Paul begins to talk about treasures in jars of clay, the fragileness of human life, the fragileness of the human vessel carrying the great message of salvation. And 2 Corinthians 4, beginning in verse 7, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. I think about that, and I think about what sadness that Jeremiah had, but even in his deepest mourning for God's people, the fall of Jerusalem, the loss of a great nation, Jeremiah could lament but had faith. Jeremiah could mourn but knew that there would be hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. And so as you go through Lamentations, and you might want to sit down and read all 5 of these very short chapters, because I believe that it'll bless you. It'll take away the pridefulness of our human selves and put the glory and the honor and the praise back into God's hands. That's what he's calling us into, even this very day. So I trust that you'll read that. I will be posting the Bible Project video on Lamentations very soon. Hope you are all doing well on this beautiful Easter Monday. Stay faithful, stay hopeful, stay in love with God. I'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.